morning, everybody, and welcome to this second session of the ICSH Biennial Conference, which is on the outlook for the Irish housing market. Clearly, whatever our perspective is on housing delivery, the performance of the market is of critical importance to ensuring the delivery of Housing for All targets. We're joined by four speakers today with very different and unique perspectives on the housing market. I'm going to call on first Marie Hunt, who's Executive Director at CBRE, well known to most as a commentator on housing market on the housing market in general. And Marie, of course, was originally the founder of the research unit at CBRE in Dublin. So without further ado, Marie, can I ask you to present to us, please?
Thank you. I think my duty today is just to give a quick overview in terms of where the market is at. I think nobody would disagree that the housing market has been broken for a number of years. Whether you're talking about public sector delivery, private sector, we have a fundamental shortage of supply, and that's causing problems in lots of different parts of the market. The image that comes to mind for me when I talk about the housing market is a recipe, in that we have lots of vested interests, all with different opinions in terms of what needs to change. And obviously there's lots of different parts of the housing market as well. And invariably when you try to fix one, you cause problems somewhere else. This can be rectified by engaging with the industry. And I think this is something that has started to happen a lot more recently. And this avoids what's happened in the past in terms of implementing policy that subsequently has to be changed, and all of the unintended consequences that have come in from all the countless proposals that we have seen over many, many years. And obviously in the last decade, we've seen lots of different housing ministers, we've seen lots of different plans being brought into place. But thankfully, more recently, we've seen the publication of Housing for All. Now, while I don't agree with every single one of the 200 plus measures that are within the document, in general, the industry welcomes it because it is a blueprint. And I think unlike some of the reports that went in the past, it has multidisciplinary input. And it's a multi-annual program over the next decade, regardless of who's in power. So it's a 10-year plan as opposed to being linked to the political cycle. And that's absolutely a huge step in the right direction. The fundamental issue in the housing market, from my perspective, is a lack of supply. This has caused problems across all types and all tenures, as I've mentioned. And there obviously are lots of barriers to delivery in the market. And just to go through some of the key deliveries, talking from the perspective of a developer at the moment, there's huge viability challenges. We have lots of houses in the planning process, but unlike other markets, we can't really draw any correlation between the amount of stock that's in planning versus how much is likely to get delivered this year, next year, the following year. There's a huge gulf between the volume of stock in planning and delivery. And the main reason for that is many of the schemes are not viable at the moment, particularly in an environment where the construction costs are so high and where the material and the input costs are rising with inflationary pressures at the moment. And again, in Ireland's case, because we have raised the bar so high in terms of the planning regime and design requirements, and particularly now in relation to ESG, we've raised the cost inputs as well. I think the political situation has usually been a problem, and I think that's why I welcome the Housing for All document in terms of its long-term planning, because traditionally the housing regime has been very much tied to the political cycle, and that's much shorter, and obviously that's a step in the right direction. And then obviously planning issues are a big issue, particularly at the moment when we have things like the judicial review process, the strategic housing development process, delays to the delivery of water and other services. All of this is making it difficult. And anecdotally, hearing from developers that they're employing senior counsel and barristers before they even employ planners and architects, because they anticipate having to go through the planning process several times before they will achieve a delivery. And the challenge that brings is that it's very difficult to second guess the delivery date for schemes when you don't know how many times you're going to have to go through the planning process. Other challenges, and it will be a huge challenge for the Housing for All document, is capacity within the construction sector, because it's already severely challenged. We don't have all of the Central and Eastern European workers that we would have had back in the most recent cycle. And I suppose the challenge, if you're to try and bring those people back into the economy at the moment, is we absolutely have to house them while they're delivering stock for us. So that's a huge challenge. And I know the government have set a figure of 27,500 construction workers, and that's a huge challenge. Not only do we need construction workers, but we also need capacity within the local authorities and within the approved housing bodies in relation to the delivery of social housing. All of these bodies are currently challenged in terms of capacity. So I think we need to ramp up significantly there if we're going to have any hope of achieving the level of construction that's needed and that's anticipated within that document. Another huge challenge is bureaucracy. There's been a huge amount of procurement and bureaucracy, particularly in relation to the delivery of social housing, looking specifically at things like long-term leasing. And I suppose the other issue is lack of certainty. We have an awful track record of constantly changing the rules, constantly bringing in new policy, trying things out, throwing them into that recipe pot, and then trying to take them back out when they don't work. And as recently as yesterday, there was discussion around the recent change to rent increases, which were linked to inflation, taking that away again, just because inflation has started to creep up globally over the last while. We cannot keep changing the policy, particularly in short time frames. We have to allow for time for these measures to take effect and stop changing. And the reason why I would be very concerned about this is talking to international investors, talking to funders, talking to developers. If we're going to try to continue to attract these into the market, and particularly trying to attract big contractors that we're going to need to deliver the stock, they're not going to come into a market where the rules keep changing halfway through the game. My final slide is just to summarize some of the points from my perspective. I don't think there's a quick fix. I think absolutely the objective needs to be to increase supply and reduce costs. So housing affordability, increasing affordability for everybody within the market. And I think that's a challenge that can really only be fixed by increasing supply. The other unfortunate piece is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So with the best will in the world, even if we deliver housing for all exactly as it says on the tin, we're not going to see the manifestations of that for 2 to 3 years, in my view. And unfortunately, in the short term, we're going to continue to see price rises and rent rises. And that's going to be a challenge, because that's what's going to dominate the narrative, where in actual fact, we need to give this plan time to work. We need to have the courage of our convictions and give time for this plan to be delivered. I don't think there's one particular house type or one particular tenure that's going to fix the market. We need a combination of all types and all tenures. We need housing, public and private. We need housing for senior people. We need social housing. We need public sector housing. We need student accommodation. All of these types and tenures in all locations, and every single house that we produce, regardless of what type or tenure, is going to help to ease the overall situation. I personally don't think that delivery can happen without the private sector. Absolutely, we do need to get in gear and get the public sector delivering housing and building housing again through their own delivery, and also through approved housing bodies, the Land Development Agency, all of these contributors. But we also need private sector collaboration. And private sector are very much involved from a development perspective, from a funding perspective. And absolutely, the way we're going to fix this is having collaboration between the two. And for that reason, I think the whole narrative that we've seen, particularly playing out in the media over the last 2 to 3 years, condemning everybody who comes into the market international. We need that capital and we need that investment. And I firmly believe that a huge amount of the housing stock that has been delivered in the last 3 to 4 years simply would not have been built were it not for this international collaboration. So we need to welcome it, as opposed to condemning it and calling everything a vulture fund. That isn't helpful, and it is starting to scare off investors, developers and funders, so it needs to stop. And I think the other thing that needs to stop, and hopefully the Housing for All will be the final piece here, is that we need to stop chopping and changing policy, particularly without engagement with the industry. And I think Housing for All, in that sense, because it's a very comprehensive document with over 200 recommendations, if we allow time for that to bed in and stop changing policy intermittently, all of this will play a part. So hopefully that's given you a snapshot from my perspective in terms of where I think the market is. I would be very hopeful that this is actually going to deliver both public and private sector housing, but we do need to give it time to work.
Marie, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and concise presentation on that, and a number of questions there to be answered, which we come to. I should have said at the outset, if you do have questions, can you please put them in through the question and answer function on the platform, and we'll pass them through to you at that stage. Okay, our next speaker is Pat O'Sullivan, who's the head of research at AIB Group, and Pat has extensive experience working in the financial markets, and of course, obviously, the banks have a critical role to play in delivery of housing over the coming years. So, Pat, can I ask you to give us your presentation, please?
Thanks, Aidan, and good morning. This is AIB's third year sponsoring the Irish Congress of Social Housing Conference, and reflects the importance of the social housing sector to AIB. AIB has long been actively involved in the funding of social housing and in this sector. And last year we launched the 300 million social housing fund, which has now been fully subscribed. And this year our CEO, Culhane, announced a new 500 million social housing fund. And this fund is specifically targeted funding the development funding for social housing, and is managed in the area that I work in, real estate finance. Our colleagues in corporate banking provide more long-term funding for social housing, primarily for built and in-place social housing, and primarily to AHBs. Furthermore, our activity in social affordable housing is a key component and very important part of in us meeting our sustainability targets and goals. AIB is the first Irish bank to issue a green bond, which now stands at 1.75 billion. And we're the first Irish bank to launch a social bond framework, and the first bond from that will be issued in the coming weeks. And social housing and affordable housing play a very important part in the loans and bonds that fit into those issuances. Now, just turning to the outlook for the Irish housing market. Firstly, I think next slide. Sorry. Firstly, I think it's important just to put things in context a little bit, that the rising in house prices is not a uniquely Irish phenomenon, and it's in fact a global phenomenon, where we've seen house prices accelerate quite sharply since the ending of the GFC around 2009-10 onwards. And the primary result for the global increase in house prices is the fact that interest rates have fallen quite sharply, which has resulted in mortgages having collapsed between 2007 and 2020, and that has been, characteristic of most economies across the OECD and across European countries. But I suppose next slide. What's a little surprising, I suppose, at one level, is the fact that Irish house prices. If you could, move next slide. The fact that while Irish house prices have increased, they haven't increased much beyond the levels of rate of growth that we've seen in many other countries, again within the EU and within the OECD. And given the particular features of the Irish market, where we have a uniquely strong demographic growth in our economy, where the population is growing, which is not characteristic of most European countries and most OECD countries. And also we've been characterized by very moderate and very modest supply over the last decade, or very little supply over the last decade. One would have anticipated or possibly expected that the rate of growth in Irish house prices would be actually far outpacing the rate of growth that we've experienced in other European and OECD countries. And the green line there is Irish house prices, and we're in the middle, maybe towards the upper end of our peers, but certainly nothing dramatically outpacing that. And one of the primary reasons why house prices have not accelerated more is due to the central bank's macroprudential rules, as they have in effect suppressed demand for house purchases. However, this demographic demand for housing hasn't evaporated, but rather has spilled over into the rental market. And as you can see in the next slide here, the real pressure, the acute pressure that is materializing in the Irish market is been focused in the rental market. And there we can see Irish rents have far outpaced the rate of growth of rents in many other countries, again, many of our peer countries in the OECD and in Europe. And not only has the rate of growth accelerated quite strongly, and we're now a bit of an outlier in terms of the rate of rental growth in the Irish market. And next slide, please. but the actual level of rents in Ireland are very, very high. This chart is a chart that we published on a number of occasions over the last number of years in our various publications, and it's taken from the EU Commission. The EU Commission surveys the levels of rents for a typical apartment in a similar location across the various cities that they have ambassadors in. And in a Dublin context, there's only 4 cities that have higher rents than us based on this survey, and that includes London, New York, Tokyo, and Geneva. And that really is out of kilter for the kind of market, for the kind of economy Dublin is, and it illustrates the affordability challenges, particularly in the rental side of the Irish market. Next slide, please. And this manifests itself, for example, that it is now much cheaper to buy than it is to rent in the Irish market by a significant quantum. On average, about the monthly repayments is roughly 30% cheaper, 30 to 40% cheaper for most parts of Ireland, including most parts of Dublin, to buy than it is to rent. And that type of gap doesn't normally persist in markets. Normally, yeah, mortgages and rental levels do oscillate, and they tend to get above or below each other, but not to the same extent that we're experiencing in the Irish market, and not for such a sustained period of time. So if households could borrow to buy, they'd be much better off to buy than it is to rent, given current rents in the Irish market. And then just the chart on the right, and the Dublin rent as a percent of average earnings, the level of rent now as a percent of individual average earnings are very, very elevated and not really sustainable at these levels. And this is characteristic of the wider Irish market. So next slide, please. The housing market, the Housing for All strategy really has a large number of strategies, number of initiatives to try and tackle this, but ultimately the core solution, as Maria alluded to or mentioned earlier in her presentation, is that supply is the only way that these problems are ultimately going to be addressed. And certainly the supply forecast or estimates in the Housing for All strategy are very, very ambitious, with expectation of 300,000 houses to be built over the next 9 years. That's a material step up in activity than what has characterized the Irish market over the last decade. Housing supply, as we know, has been, very, very muted, very, very subdued in the face of strong population growth. And for 2020 to 2030 onwards, the population is still going to grow quite strongly, but hopefully with the ambition of the Housing for All strategy, that number of residential homes and housing apartments will increase quite materially. And that rate of growth, next slide, is spread across both public and private. And again, reiterating the point that Marie, sorry, if you could move on to the next slide, that'd be great, thanks. As Marie mentioned, the only way those ambitious targets can be achieved is by collaboration and effective mobilization of both the public and private sector. One of the concerns, and it was highlighted within the Housing for All strategy, though, is capacity constraints. And we need, and the key capacity constraint one of the key capacity constraints in our mind is the number of people that will need to be employed in the construction sector. The Housing for All strategy estimates another 27,500 workers will need to come into the construction sector in order to ensure 33,000 homes and houses are built per annum over the next 9 years. So it's hard to see that number being, achieved in the next 1 to 2 or 3 years. So unfortunately, in the very, very short term, I think we could see further house price inflation because of the level of activity that's going to be, generated within the sector. Next slide just illustrates the point that the public sector level of activity is expected to ramp up quite significantly. And not only is the amount of housing coming from the public sector going to increase, but the type of housing, direct builds, is a very important part of that, and that adds to the capacity constraints within the construction sector, particularly in the shorter term. And again, it'll probably be a couple of years before we see a material step up in levels of supply in output in the Irish market. And as a consequence, to sum up, we probably will see further house price inflation, and probably significant house price inflation over the next 1 to 2 or 3 years. Rents probably will increase, but the rate of growth, I think, will be a lot more subdued because of the level of affordability issues that I've highlighted previously in the slides. And finally, the constraint, particularly around labour in particular, less so around commodities, I think will be a big factor that will be a problem that needs to be overcome in the next 1 to 2 years. And I conclude on that, Aidan. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Pat, for a very useful presentation. Lots of very interesting information, and I think it complemented Marie's very well and gives us some points for discussion after the presentations. Again, just to remind anybody, if you have questions, to put them in through your through the questions and answer function on the conference platform. Our next speaker is Gregorio de Castro, who is the Deputy Head of Unit at DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, responsible for overseeing the European Social Fund, the European Semester and the Resilience and Recovery Plans. Gregorio has experience of Ireland as he oversees a number of these programmes insofar as they concern Ireland. And he also worked in Eurofound, which is the European Foundation for Living and Working Conditions, which is of course based in Dublin. Gregorio, you're very welcome. Can I ask you to deliver your presentation?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to be here. My connection to Ireland goes even further. My first son was born there in Dublin, so it's always very nice to speak to an Irish audience. And I'm very sad that we can't be meeting physically due to the restrictions in place. When the European Commission was asked to speak at this conference, we were asked to focus on social and affordable housing. And I think this will complement quite nicely what we've heard from the previous speakers. Now, it's important, first of all, to know that the European Commission has no specific competence, policy competence in the area of housing, because it is very much linked to land use and it's very much linked to taxation. Therefore, our role is primarily to ensure that social inclusion, social cohesion, territorial cohesion through housing policies is respected and is ensured. As a body signatory to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the EU has, of course, to defend and fight extreme poverty and homelessness and ensure that all its citizens have access to adequate, safe and affordable housing. In 2017, the European Commission and all the member states of the EU signed up to the European Pillar of Social Rights. Principle 19 stresses the need for social housing or housing systems of good quality. So our role is one more of coordinator and one of surveillor of the principles and the rights that I've just outlined. We can move on to the next slide, please. The European Commission also advocates for a housing first approach when it comes to social and affordable housing. We believe that in order for every human being to live in dignity and to have a place in society and participate to society and economic life, we need to start by providing immediate access to permanent housing. Now, this also has to be accompanied by the choice of the participant to self-determination. So once they have a roof over their house, they need to be part and parcel of the participation and determination that they choose for themselves in life. Recovery orientation is important in that it leads to an individualized and participant and tailored driven support for individuals to break out of a cycle of precariousness, housing precariousness, and it leads onto a greater social and community integration, which allows, as I said, for participation, active participation in economic and social life. Next slide, please. Now, what do we do here from Brussels? We primarily monitor, as I mentioned, EU and social housing policies at member state level. And we do this through what is known as the European Semester, which is a framework for surveillance and coordination of macroeconomic policies across the EU. This results in annual reports and country-specific recommendations. And in this respect, as you can see from the slide, Ireland has been receiving country-specific recommendations related to housing since 2017, whether these cover issues of infrastructure, whether these are about implementations of plans, at the time in 2018, the National Development Plan, including the housing principles that were contained therein, whether these are about focusing investment on affordable and social housing policy, or more recently, about the provision of social and affordable housing. It's no surprise, and it's been said by the previous speakers, that the Irish housing market has been broken. It's been broken since the financial crisis, and numerous factors have contributed to creating a perfect storm in this sense, whether it's bankruptcies, whether it's a lack of skilled people, whether it's access to land, whether it has been uneven access to credit by buyers, and of course, very tight and stringent financial rules. Next slide, please. Now, we also, as mentioned by previous speakers, have noted the unevenness that there is between supply and demand, particularly when it comes to social housing, which is what I'm focusing my presentation on today. It's true that we are on the right track in Ireland towards increasing social housing provision, but Ireland starts from one of the lowest bases in the EU, and therefore the catch-up is much higher. The demand remains very high, and the demand has grown exponentially, first during the financial crisis, which saw unemployment rise massively, which saw inequalities deepen tremendously in Ireland, and this was not fixed. And then we were hit by the COVID crisis, which unfortunately, again, took its brunt on the more vulnerable, on the less able, on the less employable, and on the more socially marginalized cohorts in the Irish community. So as a result, we see that the demand has kept on rising, and over the last decade, supply and provision has hardly taken off and been able to keep up. We welcome very much the long-term and stable 10-year vision that the Housing for All document provides. We believe that this is exactly what the Irish market needs. It needs predictability, it needs stability, and this also needs to be coupled with even investments in private housing, affordable housing, and social housing. Perhaps a slight criticism, if I may, is the fact that we don't believe the level of social housing to be built over the next decade, and affordable housing will be enough to meet the demands of the more vulnerable and those most in need. Next, please. So, as I said, housing completions have increased, but from a very low base. We saw as early as March of this year that over nearly 6,000 adults were availing of homelessness service. And what is very, very worrying in our respect is that the fact that there are a lot of dependents that are also in need of social housing. So we can see that this is, for many households, an intergenerational issue. So if you're born into social housing, you are likely to remain in social housing, or breaking out of social housing becomes very difficult. So your chances are in a way very often marked from very early on. The average rent, as was said earlier, has risen much faster over the last decade than the average earnings, and therefore this is a big impediment also for people to access housing. And from what we see in recent surveys, young respondents are less likely now to live in owner-occupied housing than they are to live in rental accommodation. In terms of housing security, there are certain groups that are much more exposed and worse off than others: migrants, lone parents, the unemployed, the long-term unemployed. And we see also that non-Irish nationals and children are likely to live in overcrowded housing conditions, which is far from ideal because it breeds this cycle of intergenerational housing poverty. Now, what have we done recently from the European Commission? We have launched in June of this year, under the Portuguese presidency of the EU, the European Platform to Combat Homelessness. we seek to nurture a space that allows for mutual learning for policymakers and practitioners to contribute to harness EU funding possibilities, of which there are many, strengthening evidence and monitoring on homelessness and access to social and affordable housing across the EU. We've created a new innovative prize at the European level to reward good practices, and we will review progress by the end of the decade towards the eradication of homelessness by 2030. Next, please. The European Resilience and Recovery Facility is, of course, something that you will all be familiar with. Ireland will receive 1 billion euros in grants in this respect. And this is a plan that will consist of a series of reforms and investments. Ireland has put forward two major reforms to cover the issue of social and affordable housing. The Land Development Agency Act, which has been passed through this year, and the Affordable Housing Act, both of which we strongly welcome. Next, please. Now, what we think is important, though, is that social housing and affordable housing policies don't just focus on the bricks and mortars. We believe that the people also need important and regular access to social services. In this respect, the European Social Fund, which we are actually negotiating or about to start negotiating with the Irish government, can provide and allow for the provision of social services, counselling, improving policy, and including the social and a more inclusive social housing system. We believe that by allowing skills development, inclusive education, labour market inclusion and integration, people in social housing and in affordable housing will be able to break out of this cycle. Therefore, it's important that all funds at the disposal of the Irish government, whether these are national, whether these are from private investors, or whether these are indeed Europeans, are developed in a way that seek to harness synergies, that seek to be complementary of one another and not duplicate efforts. And we believe very much that partnership-based approaches in the design and in the implementation and monitoring of housing policies are fundamental and are essential for drawing lessons and for addressing the needs of all concerned. Next, please. Finally, let me conclude by recalling that, yes, there are challenges remaining, as has been said, both in terms of constructions, but from our point of view, the human factor is very important, and the social service provision to the occupants of social and affordable housing are of paramount importance. Bills and social services therefore need to go hand in hand. The responses should abide by the housing first principles that I've just enumerated, and we need to ensure synergies between all funds as well as the involvement of all partners. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak.
Gregorio, thank you very much for your presentation. Our final speaker is Enda McGuane, who's the Managing Director of Winters Property Management. Enda is a chartered surveyor on two fronts, on both the planning and development side and on the property management and facilities side. He also is an examiner in the Technological University of Dublin Property and Facilities Management degree course. Enda, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Aidan, and look, thanks to everybody to see such a wide and varied attendance. So, look, good morning, everybody. Thanks again to the ICSH for setting up what is a very worthwhile event. Hopefully, what I'm going to do over the next 8 minutes or so is build on some of the themes that our previous speakers have discussed, and specifically focusing in housing, but getting down, I suppose, a little bit more in the weeds, particularly on the area of costs and viability. I'm going to take a look at housing for all, and again, in the context of the cost rental model, and put forward some considerations that we need to bear in mind when adapting this sort of model and moving forward. forward, and particularly when we're looking for long-term solutions. Obviously, in addition to my day-to-day working experience, I'm also involved in a number of AHBs, both Tier 3 and Tier 2. So hopefully I can bring that perspective to bear this morning. First and foremostly, I just need to, I'm here as a member of the Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland. The Society, as many of you are aware, is an independent professional body for surveyors working across Ireland. Surveyors, as many people anticipate, they all reflect on a quantity surveyor, but in fact there are 12 different practicing disciplines covering across the areas of land, construction and property. I suppose most recently the Society has embarked on an ambitious programme whereby we're trying to provide impartial and authoritative advice on key issues, in particular in relation to housing for government. And I'll be using some of the cost of apartment building stats that we've delivered earlier on this year. So look, where are we now? And again, some of the speakers before me have touched on many of these themes. You know, specifically down there at the bottom, I wanted to emphasize the material and labour costs, the issues they are creating right at this moment in time as we reconvene and reopen. I suppose the main factor that we see is that the impact on tender price inflation obviously is only going in one direction, but I suppose the added uncertainty that's coming to bear is having an adverse and a negative impact on risk pricing. And what that means for people looking to embark on schemes and on projects is getting access to finance is becoming challenging on that basis. I suppose of more recent concern, I suppose, as well, given Housing for All and its ambitious objectives, is the challenge that we see on a number of government projects which have been tendered and contracts awarded, but in light of the developments mentioned above, their ability or otherwise of people to deliver on them is coming into question. I suppose that's something to bear in mind going forward. Cost has been an issue for some time. I suppose we are in a point where there's a lot of variations in it at the moment, but the underlying cost issues that were there before haven't gone away. So I suppose this is an extract from the apartment building cost report published in January. It's the third iteration of this report. For the purpose of today, I focused on a 2-bed apartment because, again, within this sector, 1 and 2-bed apartments are the ones in most demand. We see much more increase in number of singles looking for rental accommodation. Family sizes are getting smaller, and to a certain degree, elder living plays a part as well. So the data here was based on 9,500 units across 49 sites, predominantly in Dublin. And that's, again, touching on the viability issue that previous speakers have spoken on. But I suppose when this report was published, the big focus was on that construction costs are only 47% of the overall. And I suppose bear in mind what I've said previously, that these costs are going up and are varying a lot at the moment. People tended to move and look at the other costs as well. And I suppose things like risk mitigation and financing, what we have seen in the last couple of years in efforts to address these costs, people have gone more into the social housing space. And we have seen the AHBs, local authorities and charities playing a crucial role in supporting the development of apartments and supporting the viability issues. Because when you have a long-term contract in place or a commit from a body like that, it makes it easier to finance a project. And the result we've seen, you know, in the last 5 years, the percentage of new homes in the Dublin market, for example, has gone from 7 to 20%, 21% over 5 years, 21% being purchased by actors in this space. And this is a positive interaction. It's a positive delivery and it reflects the commitment government has made heretofore. But I suppose we have to bear in mind other hot rising costs that the focus will be on construction costs right now, but the other costs haven't gone away and the other challenges that are there towards viability. And I suppose viability, what tends to happen in a marketplace when it's an issue, it influences the direction of travel of the market. Hence the reason why we have seen a focus on building to rent, be it to a fund or to an AHB or a local authority, rather than building to sell, and specifically and particularly in the apartment category. Now, as we're all aware, the National Development Plan focuses on a lot of brownfield sites. We all know that our cities need to grow, and apartments are the main mechanism for doing this in a sustainable and in a best practice way. The challenge with apartments, obviously, is myriad in the sense that, you know, from a lead time perspective, you look at to build 100 apartments, the average lead time is about 3.5 years. Apartments as well, obviously, when building apartments, you cannot occupy one apartment until the whole block is completed. Hence the emphasis and focus on building to rent and supplying that marketplace, as I said, whatever tenure it may be. I suppose, and that's why people have moved in that direction, is to address that viability issue. Now, Housing for All is seeking to make some changes in this space. It's a very ambitious program. I would echo the sentiments of the previous speaker saying it's welcome. I suppose its inclusiveness in particular is welcome. I suppose for me, looking at that we recognize the need for a mix of social, affordable, cost rental and private homes over the next decade is putting it out and is recognizing that the different demographics that require housing in the Irish market. I suppose in addition to that, the commitment at the bottom of state funding of 20 billion over 5 years, which equates to approximately 4 billion per year. So I would counsel that a little bit, and it reflects on a theme that maybe Marie made earlier on. We will also require significant private investment. And an IIP report from earlier this year would have estimated that to deliver that amount of housing, it would require 7 billion per annum in private investment. And I suppose it's something that we all need to reflect on. It's a communal approach that needs to be taken to addressing issues. For example, when builders are building, it's the same builders, no matter who funds the project or who's using the project at the end, build the product across the country. I suppose then to move into the next space of affordable housing and the whole area of cost rental, I'm going to start here with a definition I put up on the screen at the bottom of this slide, which comes from the Irish Council of Social Housing report done in conjunction with NUIG. And you'll see here, this is an international definition, and it focuses on the link between operating costs and rental, as in hence the name cost rental. I suppose from the Irish perspective, and this is the Irish definition of cost rental as has been put in place, and again is coming from that ICSH report, it's much more focused on addressing the issue of rental, the high price of renting. Now this is understandable. It's the major issue that we have right now at this moment in time. But I suppose we also need to reflect on the fact that ultimately scale and building at scale and building those numbers that are mentioned in Housing for All is the key to reducing rents. I suppose the challenge with cost and our cost rental model that we're putting forward, if we don't monitor it and manage how it progresses, is it could lead to difficulties down the road in terms of operation of sites. What I mean by that is if we tie ourselves into a minimum of 25% below market rent, and we go back to a situation we had 8, 9, 10 years ago in the rental market, by delivering on those 33,000 units per annum, we could find ourselves in a situation where the long-term management and costs are difficult to attain. We've all known internationally, we've seen the inability to maintain housing stock leads to a whole host of both social and other issues. I think within this space, I suppose it's very welcome that the housing regulator, so the AHB regulator, who's coming into full action from next February, has placed a huge focus on asset management planning, right down to compartmentalized accounting. And that's something that everyone within this space needs to bear in mind, and particularly as we expand cost rental. As I say, I welcome the introduction. I think it's crucial, but we do need to bear in mind, traditionally in Ireland, we have been building properties to sell. We're now building to hold, and we need to take best practice in that regard. So for me, full life cycle costing, good management systems, good sustainable property management are the key to maintaining those assets into the future, regardless of the tenure and regardless of the ownership structure. And it's something just to bear in mind as a cautionary as we move forward. Ultimately, as I said, though, addressing barriers to supply is the key to ensuring success. So I think where we've seen at the moment, the planning delays, I think it's welcome that the interventions are being made at the moment in the planning process and how we're looking at reviewing at it. We do need to, as Marie said, stabilize the process and allow that people can forward plan 3 to 5 years and avoid tinkering going forward. I think things like HISCO and the infrastructural investment they're making are very worthwhile. Now, HISCO is something that is developed out of originally in Cork, but is expanding its remit nationwide. For any of you who are not familiar with it, it is worth exploring because of what they're trying to do in terms of providing funding specifically for infrastructural investment. Obviously, land availability and cost were on that slide I used earlier on, and the LDA's role, and particularly Project Tussock as they're embarking on going forward from Housing for All, is going to be crucial in delivering some sites and units to the market. From another perspective, the finance, the procurement, labour skills and shortages and the tender inflation are all mentioned earlier on by previous speakers, so I'm not going to dwell on them here, but they are integral in getting good solutions in place and sustainable solutions in place is important to bring sure that we can deliver as a uniform approach all the properties that are required. I suppose ultimately, we have seen a lot of debate over this over the last number of years. There's a lot of unintended consequences, as we've seen in the last couple of days from the rental perspective, changes that are made without a broader engagement, I think, and a full consideration on these changes. It's really important that we continue with a data-driven open debate, which is all the stakeholders, regardless of where they come from, acting together to address the issues of supply, the affordability and sustainability. And that dialogue that is being put forward today by the likes of the ICSH needs to continue on going forward. So look, I'd like to thank you all for your time. I've left you on the screen there with some recommendations that SCSI has made for the budget, and I look forward to some Q&A. Thank you.
Enda, thank you very much for that, and can I thank all the speakers for obviously for their content, but also for their brevity and conciseness in dealing with this issue, which gives us a few minutes for questions. There's a number of questions in which reflect the diversity of the discussion, but I suppose one thing that there seemed to be agreement on was a welcome for Housing for All, in the sense that it is seen as a longer term plan And a second item where I think there was agreement was on the need for partnership across public and private sectors. I just want to go to, I'm going to ask Marie this question, which came in, because I think it will, she touched on it in her presentation. And the question was, do you anticipate a change in the appetite from international funds for investment in Irish housing, given the political backlash and policy changes that have come in recently?
I think yes is the answer to that. I think we're seeing international investors investing across all different sector types. And I suppose anecdotally what we're hearing is if they buy an office building or they invest in nursing homes or hotels, they're welcomed with open arms, and they buy something residential and provide housing for people, and suddenly they're all over the press as being a negative vulture fund, cuckoo fund, whatever term you want to use. So they don't need that negative publicity. They can invest in any other jurisdiction and not have that. And I think it's something that's unique to Ireland. I think we still continue to see some investment, but I think definitely the mood is shifting, and it's negative publicity, but it's also constant policy change as well. That's very frustrating, because again, that's not something you see in other jurisdictions.
Okay, well, following on from that, and I throw this open to the panel, clearly building 300,000 homes requires a colossal amount of capital. Is Housing for All adequately funded? Has enough thought been given to how we're going to deliver this quantum of housing over the next number of years? Pat, you might touch on that.
Sure. The estimates to deliver that amount, say on a per annum basis, range from to deliver, say, 33,000 units per annum will range from about 7 to 10 billion a year. The government is committing 4 billion. There's a lot of finance and funds available to both fund development, but also the fund the takeout as well. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about is there funding out there available for this, but it's the environment in which we create to attract that into Ireland, because Ireland isn't the only economy that needs funding for residential development, that needs funding for PRS and rental stock, etc. So I would concur with what Marie is saying, is that we've got to be very careful around the amount of changes we make to policy, how we describe this type of investment. So I wouldn't have concern that the funding is there potentially. I'd be concerned about the environment in which that funding would be attracted to Ireland in particular. It's a shame because the long-term cost of debt is so low. Funders are looking for areas to put their capital. And when we're talking about funding from these funds, it's not, anonymous big institutions. That's what pulled it together. The vast bulk of this money comes from pension funds, from individuals that save every year for the long-term savings and pensions. So it's really it's funneling that capital into very productive use in the economy.
Okay, thanks, Pat. There's a question in here. I suspect I know the answer that I'm going to get, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do the panel think there's a case to relax the macro-prudential rules to facilitate, I suppose, more people give more people access to finance? Gregorio, you might touch on that. Do the Central Bank of Ireland macro-prudential rules, which confine the amount that households can borrow, should they be relaxed to facilitate more households' access to home ownership?
Well, I mean, there's very clear and strict rules ever since the financial crisis when it comes to lending that have been imposed across the whole banking sector across the EU. There are very severe tests that banks have to meet in order to demonstrate their financial solvency and viability. And if banks can prove that they can indeed take on the risk, then this is of course within their prerogative. The issue is, of course, I mean, making credits available in an equal manner and in a risk, or let's say in a low risk manner, to everybody. So it's not the same lending to somebody who has been unemployed for a long period of time, than it is to someone who has, stable income but hasn't been able to get, because of previous rules, access to credit. So I think it should not become a divisive factor, whatever it is, and it should remain something that leads towards equal access to housing, equal access to credit, and not just favoring a few and the more able.
Okay, thanks, Gregorio. We just have very little time left. I'm just going to ask Enda a question on the phasing out of long-term leasing between local authorities and private developers. Housing for All has indicated a change in direction in this, that local authorities and private developers will no longer enter into leasing arrangements for social housing. We've talked a lot around the need for supply and the need for all channels of delivery to be brought into effect. Do we think that that's going to affect supply and housing delivery, Enda?
I think what you're ultimately going to see from that process is a change in direction of travel, obviously, from suppliers, in the sense that I think the approved housing bodies may take up some of that slack. So, you know, that they will take ownership of those properties through the mechanisms that already exist. And that then, as already happens, that when houses come into the social space, it's coming off local authority lists, which is done in conjunction with the approved housing bodies. I suppose it's important that any change we do make, we need to make sure that it is increasing the levels of supply and not reducing opportunities. The key focus here has been, up till now, has been a very narrow debate. The debate needs to be as broad as possible, and that's the advantage Housing for All gives. It recognises the multitude of tenures that we need, and we need to keep it a wide field. Our requirements are such that we need international funding, we need Irish funding, we need everybody involved in this process, and that's the piece we want to not lose sight of at any of the policy interventions we're putting forward.
Could I just come in on that, Aidan, because I feel very strongly about this. I think social leasing played a part. I think there was one problem with it, and that's that at the end of the 20-25 years, it didn't revert back to the local authority or the state ownership. And I just think it's a shame then, because of that issue, that the whole thing is being torn apart and we're deciding we're throwing it out. We're throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. It served a purpose, and surely we can come up with a way of changing it so that the ownership comes back to the state. There must be some financial modelling that could be done to fix the problem with it, as opposed to tearing the whole concept up and starting from scratch and taking time to come up with something that's better. So I just feel strongly that we should look at that again, rather than deciding we're not going to do it at all anymore.
Certainly something that I don't think we fully explored before the channel was cut off. Can I thank the panel very much for very interesting presentations, which each brought a fresh perspective, but also a common degree of consensus and agreement on the issues that face us all in housing. Can I thank you all very much again for your time and for your presentations and for answers to the questions. And with that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you very much.